Okay, hello. Today is March the 3rd. Mercury has just ingressed into Pisces, and it's going to be interesting. On the 16th of March, we're going to have a triple conjunction with the Sun, the Mercury, a Sun-Mercury Cazimi conjunct with Neptune. All three planets perfectly conjunct on the same degree at 25 Pisces. And that will be shortly after the ingress of Saturn into Pisces, which happens around the time of the full moon. So Saturn will already be in Pisces at that time, so we will actually have a 4-planet stellium in Pisces. So we have a fully loaded Pisces season that we're heading into right now. That's just the Pisces getting amped up already because Mercury just went in there. And that's the astrological background for where I'm taking this video. My idea for today's video is around this thing about Pisces and Neptune specifically, although there's certain issues that I was raising in a video that I made talking about Rick Tarnas' Cosmos and Psyche, and I don't know, because one of the things I wanted to do anyways is that I am interested in the outer planets, but I wanted to at least qualify that before really diving in by expressing maybe some of the doubts or some of the issues of they're kind of their own category and how do we understand them and this kind of stuff. I do think that there is an argument to be made maybe for using the outer planets, but then not using the Kuiper Belt objects because they're basically just too many of them and they're too far out, and that it just kind of gets redundant. And that's another issue. When I think you're doing astrology or you're doing any divination work, is that it may not necessarily be a matter of whether or not these objects are useful or that they can work, but the issue is basically redundancy. That if you're trying to get a message, it's kind of like finding the signal in the noise, right? And that even if if you have to check this many different things to get the green light that says yes, then at some point in time it just becomes redundant. Like, you don't have to. We've already got a divination from these planets. We don't have to look at the other ones to get more information. We know what we need to know. It's just redundant to look at more details, unless there are important details that you need to look. I don't know. This is getting off track maybe, but that's the issue with the trans-Neptunian planets, or whatever you want to call them, dwarf planets, in my eyes. Anyways, with Richard Tarnas, I do think that his observations around Uranus-Neptune are useful for understanding astrology from a generational point of view, especially if you notice I'm somewhat of a young man. I was born in the 80s, and it's kind of interesting. I've been watching a documentary series from Adam Curtis. I really like Adam Curtis shows, even though they can be fairly depressing. And the last one that he put out, I'm a bit late to the party because apparently it was out a few months ago. I guess I was just too busy doing my own astrology videos and making modular synth music that I just was, it went over my head that there was a new Adam Curtis series. I had no idea. But I ended up watching it. I'm in the middle of it, and honestly, it's kind of difficult to watch because I'm at the part where they're talking about the war in Chechnya and a lot of traumatic. It's called the Trauma Zone. It's about the fall of the Soviet Union and the failure of democracy in Eastern Europe, and I guess also I could say the balkanization of Eastern Europe. It's kind of heavy, to be honest. But one of the things that I think is actually applicable is that somebody else is going to have to fill this in with more information. But I do know that the Neptune Archetype has some weird correspondence with the topic of communism. Because if you look at the times when the original Lenin, the Communist Revolution, and these various juncture points of when they had, I'm pretty sure it was the 30-year mark of Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, of these different critical points for the Soviet Union and Russia. And then you can also look at, I really like this guy Tarkovsky, and I made, what was it, last year or the year before? I made a Neptune video talking about Tarkovsky's Stalker, in the Neptune archetype, and that he has Neptune in his chart. I can't remember exactly how, but in a way that it's making a good aspect or a strong aspect. So I think there's something to do with the issues with Russia, the issues with the Soviet Union, and mainly the political ideals of different ideologies or whatever, as well as whether religious aspirations are turning the process of the collective psyche, gearing it to a certain machine, right? Whether that's a church organization, or if that's a communist party that wants to obliterate the church and take back some kind of a control from the church. It's still working with this kind of Neptune archetype in some way, by working with the collective imagination of the people. And there's something about the risk of fascism that I was talking about in my last video, that I feel like fascism and communism and these weird political ideologies, these beliefs and things like that, they're all kind of Neptunian, and especially the historical context of this Uranus-Neptune conjunction in the 80s times up perfectly with the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this is one of the things that I find Rick Tarnas really interesting to write about. Oh, I'm going to just here, we've got the book. I'm going back to Cosmos and Psyche. Now, one of the things, I also have to admit, I just released another electronic album. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about electronic music here, because I don't know how many of my astrology friends are into it. Maybe there's more than I would think, but he kind of talks about this kind of stuff about, Uranus-Neptune being associated with that kind of stuff that became popular in the 90s, and Burning Man and stuff like this, and a re-interest in spirituality of, Rumi got translated to English, that got popular around that time. And then in this chapter, he also compares and contrasts that with a Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 60s. And the 60s had a certain kind of revolutionary kind of upheaval. If you look at what was happening with the anti-war protests, which was what happening with the civil rights movement, and there was this is one of the things, if you look at Adam Curtis from a more of an archetypal point of view, one of the things that was happening, you had in the 60s, you had the Weather Underground, which were people which white people hippie people who were kind of legit, almost like terrorists, and in their revolution, and that kind of got put an end to in the end of the 60s and the 70s, and the revolutionary spirit was kind of squashed out, and then eventually it just kind of all went to this Reagan-Thatcher thing. And it's interesting because Reagan actually used astrologers, right? So Reagan in some way knew what he was doing, in the sense that around the time of the Reagan-Thatcher era initiated, there was a Saturn and Jupiter conjunction in Libra, and Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions stand for major kind of cultural shifts. What's interesting is that we just had one that timed up with the pandemic, right? So the major cultural shift of the pandemic is in the same way a repetition of the same archetypal process that was there when Reagan capitalized on this in the early 80s and implemented this kind of, dare I say, neoliberal regime of politics, right? But the point is that if you take the astrology seriously, and we actually realize that Reagan was using with astrologers, I don't want to be too conspiratorial here or anything, but he was literally doing a kind of political magic at the grand scale, and I think we should be smart enough to recognize this, right? That to try to break the spell of Reaganism, or at least become more aware of what's been going on. But these politicians have been at least Reagan was working with the planets, we know, right? But the problem, though, is that there's also the whole thing, right? I was watching. I think there's a tendency whatever. There's good and bad. There's the shadow and the light, or whatever, of any archetype, right? So it's not just that people tend to, when I think about the 90s, I think of this kind of sense of this kind of idealism of a kind of, the scholastic kind of books, or there's a kind, I went to a Montessori school, and we would have these, instead of Halloween, they wanted to have a, like, everybody dress up as like different cultures, and then, well, we're all a diverse community celebrating this, global peace and harmony. And that, but that kind of goes with this thing in the West, that the fall of the Soviet Union to the West was kind of like, we can now live united as one humanity. We don't have to have these ideological differences between us. We're all happy. We can all get along. And even in the Adam Curtis documentary, they kind of have this thing about the Christian missionaries going to go sing Kumbaya and sort of comfort these poor, right? But it's like, it's a little bit, it's a way, these people who are supposed to be, their religion is them being sensitive and caring, and in a way it seems kind of tone deaf, or it seems like kind of insensitive, in that they're kind of coming from this really privileged American background to a place that's being completely devastated without really having any appreciation for what these people are actually going through, the actual reality of the situation, and that it may not be so easy just to say some nice thing. And that's one of the issues that it's also the whatever Tarnas is trying to do with Cosmos and Psyche is maybe kind of outside of the scope of it, but in this kind of context, right? But what I'm trying to say is there's some real problems. Saturn was also there in the 80s, though, so it could be the Saturn getting into that Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. But after watching this documentary, it makes me appreciate how I grew up in the 90s in a really privileged circumstance, and I am biologically have Ukrainian, Eastern European blood in me, and to see that the people of my ancestry going through so much shit, and that I've actually been there too, and you can tell that it's not, it's a broken, traumatized place. It sucks. What can I say, right? There's something about all this, though, too, in that in this, there's something going on in this process that was also technology coming, the internet coming, being also immersed in video games and in media culture. And there's something about Neptune of being like the world of images. And there's this kind of thing of like what has been on my mind today of being a 90s kid, being so plugged into like Sony PlayStation, being plugged into these movies, that we live in a hyper media. I kind of just feel like we live in a society of all these people who are basically walking around with the VR headsets plugged in, getting fed constant streams of, whatever, entertainment, and that we don't want to look at anything that's too difficult. We just want whatever is going to soothe our pain or whatever like that, right? And that we're kind of like the Matrix almost was kind of like, you can read the Matrix in different ways, but it's like this kind of thing that we're so plugged into thinking we're all super hot rock star millionaire. That's why I'm kind of this whole thing about like selling the dream or something like that. Like you can dream yourself to be the super fantastic, amazing, glamorous, fabulous person, and like that they're trying, like that's the dream of capitalism. But there's so many people that are living a really shitty life that aren't living that dream is, and the actual, we're all beating ourselves up because we're living a real life that image is completely removed. It's just some fantasy image, right? Like, and yet we're always whipping ourselves because like, oh, why can't I be the beautiful, successful person that? Oh, but like, where is that person? It's like it's just this image that is created, that's conditioned, that is like everyone's telling. But if you actually look at what real people, like, they're imperfect. They're sick. They're not, there's, in therapy, in healing, we want to create an idea of how resilient we are and how much capacity for adaptation and change, and we want to be hopeful, of course. There's nothing as completely understandable that we want to be optimistic and we want to be hopeful, but when we actually, our hope and our optimism creates all these ideas about how fantastic these healing modalities are, and how fantastic our advances and evolutions are, and how fantastic, super amazing light beings we are. But then there's this other side of it too, where you're like, actually, you might actually just be stuck with this thing that is like a problem that doesn't go away, or there's things like that that's like, and the two truths both have some sort of truth, right? That's like the fantasy reality or whatever, right? But I'm talking more about also just media, of being plugged into the media machine, and how when you're a little kid growing up immersed in this environment, and you've never grown up without being immersed in a super media saturated environment, you just assume that this is what life is like, right? It's like, but and it's there's something about the when you use the outer planets to understand these larger cultural shifts, like the mediated environment. I think, like, I'm going to read a little bit from Richard Tarnas here to maybe zero in on what I'm talking about. Technological innovation, Uranus, in the service of image and illusion, Neptune, is especially reflective of the Uranus-Neptune archetypal complex, and the major advances in this domain are closely associated with the unfolding alignments of this planetary cycle. Photography emerged during Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the 1820s with the work of Niepce and Daguerre. I don't know if I'm getting their names right. Motion pictures rapidly emerged as a major cultural phenomenon and art form during the following opposition of the 1889-1918 period. The immediately following square alignment of the 1950s coincided with the rapid dissemination and public emergence of television. So here you go. You've got an opposition where the medium is created. You've got a square where the television comes out and it becomes more integrated into the household of Western American families, which brought with it all its characteristic Uranus-Neptune elements, both positive and problematic. The generation of children born with the square 1950, 1960, so my mom and my dad's generation, the people right in the baby boomer era, was the first to grow up with television as a principle shaping the influence on its consciousness and mode of experiencing the world. So, in perspective, my parents were the first people to grow up with this thing that's completely new, that's completely alien, as just being a regular part of their lives, and that they are basically representative of a culture that has been shaped by this technology, and that a new culture that is unprecedented to whatever has come before it, just taking whatever it is as normal, as that this is just how we do things. You get home and you turn on the TV after work, right? That's just how you do it. As if 1950s has always been there, the thing, right? It's kind of strange, but that's kind of what something about modernity is. It feels like that. Like, what was life like before we had TV, before we had automobiles, before we had the radio? I mean, people don't even use the radio now. We got a whole new generation, right? With the internet, but the generation. Okay. It was also during this alignment that Marshall McLuhan, who, if you don't know him, check him out, he's really cool, was born in 1911 during the preceding Uranus-Neptune opposition. So McLuhan's born during the time when film starts being first invented and made and stuff, and then he comes to popularity during the 50s and 60s when it really comes into fruition into the popular culture as the home television set. And that's often what he focused a lot of his talking about, was the influence of the media on consciousness. And he had that Uranus-Neptune opposition, right, in his chart. First developed his influential theories on technology as an extension of the human nervous system. The idea, so this is like the cybernetic idea, that the idea that our nervous system, because we're so wired into our technology, that in some way it's like I've heard people talk about where they're walking down the street and you think you feel your cell phone vibrating, but then it hasn't vibrated, but your nervous system has been programmed by getting these dopamine signals, or getting to expect Pavlov's dog, right? You get a ding, you get a beep, and you expect it to be something, and we're conditioned by carrying these devices all the time that is basically, whether or not it's people are afraid of getting chips and implants and all this kind of stuff, having actual cyborg implants in their skin. Regardless, though, we are so immersed in this system that our chemical nervous system is now technology is just an extension of our nervous system, basically. And we, even if we're not on the internet, I would argue that we're probably subconsciously aware that of all these, we're so hooked into this thing about wanting achievement or approval or to be accepted into a part of a social group, that we don't even have to be on the internet for our nervous system to be pinging off with all these little things of this world that's not really there, right? And that is something to do with the Neptune, the not there-ness of this world, and yet how it seems to permeate everything, right? The transformative impact of the television medium on the cultural consciousness and the emergence of a global village unified and shaped by electronic information technologies. Hence McLuhan's prophetic role as the father of cyberspace. Finally, the completion of the Uranus-Neptune cycle that began in the 1820s conjunction and birth of photography, the conjunction of the latter 1980s and 1990s, which I started talking about, this is where I grew up, coincided with the explosion of television and multimedia technologies, hundreds of cable stations accessible worldwide through satellite and high-speed fiber optic connections, instantly selected or dismissed with a remote control device, videos and DVDs of potentially every film ever made, high-definition television, TiVos, he kind of dates it to say TiVo, camcorders, cell phone cameras, digitization of images, and other forms of cultural expression, and numerous other technological advances whose rapid dissemination took place during the period of this conjunction. Also relevant in this archetypal complex are the many cultural, social, and psychological consequences of this revolution. The globalization of culture. This is the globalization of culture. This is like, I mean, I didn't want to like portray Deleuze and Guattari as being like, well, whatever. There's this Deleuzian thing about the globalization that breaks everything down, and the whole like hipster culture, where it was like, it doesn't matter if you go to a hipster cafe in Vancouver, or if you go to a hipster cafe in London, or if you go to a hipster cafe in Melbourne, they're all going to look the same because we've got a global culture that basically anything that is whatever, like, it breaks everything down and reduces it to the lowest common denominator, and that's why all the logos end up looking the same. That's why any difference gets burnt out by capitalism. And this is Byung-Chul Han talks about this, right? The democratizing effect on the creation and dissemination of information, which is like, oh boy, it's kind of funny, like, we can have a whole conversation about that one. When this book was written, that was not quite as a concern as it is now. The democratization on the creation and dissemination of information in the post-truth, nobody knows what's going on anymore situation, and the often catalyzing influence that television and computers have had on revolutionary social and political developments. Right. That and also, are we completely just been turned into idiots through information campaigns, and everybody's basically incoherent because of the everything's messed up by this computer system of social organization, right? And they're talking about it was also kind of funny. They're talking about the Eastern European revolutions of 1989 being linked to the computers. But if you watch this Adam Curtis stuff, I find that kind of questionable. I mean, it kind of seems like a joke in the Adam Curtis context, right? He says, equally reflective of the Uranus-Neptune field has been the decisive dominance of the television media in shaping the collective imagination during this era. There's something I wanted to keep going with this because he goes into like drugs as well. But he's talking about how an especially problematic consequence of these advances has been the widespread emergence of a form of consciousness that is predominantly concerned with entertainment and consumption. And it is at once passive and ceaselessly restless. And this is great because Mark Fisher talks about this, that the kind of like, he's talking about this problem that he noticed in his students is that the motivation is always pleasure seeking, right? Or that there's other people I've talked to my generation that are trying to get into like working on themselves and developing themselves, and that a lot of what they talk about is that there's all these things around that the entertainment culture, the media culture has created all these instant gratification things where, instead of working hard, you could just play a video game and have a lot more fun, and whereas you have to delay your gratification to work hard on something that isn't immediately gratifying. But because it's just you can get the, why wait and have the big cookie when you can have a cookie now? We have this culture where people get into TikTok, they get into social media, or they get into anything that they don't really have to work at paying attention to. You can just have something hit them with like some, you can just get hit by a dopamine hit. You get hit by stimulation. You don't actually have to work on reading a book. You don't have to actually have to work on thinking. You don't have to work on understanding. You just are basically assaulted by information that disorients you to the point where you kind of forget about your stress or whatever, so you're kind of just in this constant state of being disoriented and dissociated. And then when somebody tries to talk to you about real world problems, then they're like, hey man, you're just dragging me down with your negativity, like don't take away my happy stuff, give me my sugar. And that's kind of like the problem of our society, is that people don't want to talk about anything that bothers them. They just want to have the McDonald's ice cream cone, Mickey Mouse, Disneyland, opium, crack fiend, drug hit, consciousness, ADHD, schizophrenia, spaz out thing. That's like that's our society in how I relate to it. Am I growing up in this culture? That's what it feels like to me, right? And anyways, why am I talking about this now? Why am I talking about this now? The part of the issue, I have to admit though, I had some problems with the archetypes as well. I don't want to just, but like, there's something about the milieu of like that, how that has become so normal to live life like this. And I'm talking about it in YouTube videos, and maybe I'm just as guilty as everybody else, right? But what am I trying to get here? There's something going on that Saturn is making this ingress into Pisces, right? And that Uranus-Neptune, when you put that together, there's this kind of explosion of all this media, of all this stuff, of all these images, right? That's one thing I wanted to go in this with the images, right? But and now with Saturn and Neptune though, Saturn is like that heavy weight that is, I have to admit, it was there when the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it may come as a dissolution of structures, but there's something about the heavy reality of the situation, right? That there's something that's heavy about Saturn. There's a leaden, heavy weight. And one of the things that I'm dealing with is that, having been born in this culture in the 90s, this is the main point that I want to get at, is having grown up in this environment, you kind of take it for granted that it's being shaped by this certain archetypal dynamic that's only there in a certain context. And that, that, for example, I like electronic music, but one of the things that I learned to appreciate is that if the context of techno, for example, is that in Detroit, all the factories closed, and it was really poor, and Detroit is still really poor. It never recovered, right? But Detroit techno came out of people basically throwing parties in abandoned factories, and it being kind of cool and rebellious thing to do. But in looking at the greater story of what's going on, I mean, as much as I like, there's a sort of, like, I went to Berlin too, and I like this kind of thing of an art scene that emerges out of the rubble, right? There can be beautiful things, beautiful artistic communities and creative stuff that happens out of the rubble of something. It doesn't mean that the rubble, it's what actually makes the rubble happen isn't really traumatic. Or it doesn't mean that there's also in that specific situation, like, we don't want to repeat that just to have chaos and disorder and a breakdown just so that we can have a few parties or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, because what happens is, okay, we got Burning Man came out of that. We had, some fun stuff that came out of that. We had some creative stuff that came out of that. But there's this thing, like, I remember going to school, and they made me read the story about the wasteland, how destruction is a form of creation, and that we have this sort of capitalist destruction culture that wants to break everything and then to innovate or something, right? But there's another side of that, and it's all part of but if you put that into this Uranus-Neptune cycle, what's happening right now is that the conjunction is starting to move apart, and we're coming into what is more of a sextile position for Uranus and Neptune, which in about 10 years from now is going to be more like a square, right? So we're going to have the next instance of that Uranus-Neptune archetype, which was very active during the 90s in terms of revolutionary potentials for technology and innovation, and even with all the good stuff and the bad stuff, that kind of dynamic isn't going to be that active until 10 years from now. However, we are going to be getting Jupiter and Uranus this year, later on, which is a nice one, but Jupiter moves really quick, so it's going to be, as far as these outer planets go, it's going to be a bit of a flash in the pan. It's going to, pretty soon, Jupiter will be in Gemini, and then, then whatever, right? Then you'll have Uranus in Gemini, too, right? We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves with that. I'm focusing on Neptune here, and Saturn and Neptune. There's something about the intoxication, the just bubbling over with pop music and video games and fantasy and art and stuff, with the positive thing of Uranus-Neptune, that there's a heavy weight of whether that's realism, of whether that's knowing your limitation, of having a reality check or something that goes with Saturn's ingress into Pisces. And it may be, in a way, it may actually not be so bad, because Saturn is stronger in Aquarius, and we've had to go through these really hard Saturnian years through when Saturn's in Capricorn and Saturn's in Aquarius. Maybe when Saturn's in Pisces, Saturn will start to loosen up a bit. Saturn will start to give way for some imagination or something like this. But like I said in my other video, don't take it too concretely. Don't mix up the concrete with the fluid. Don't try to build castles made of sand. You know what I mean? Yeah, I'm kind of just on a roll here. Before I go, I'm going to take a sip and hold on. Okay. There's something specific I wanted to try to just, an idea that goes with this that I want to put in here before I leave, right? To do, like, you notice in that Tarnas book, he talked about the images, about how this Neptune kind of came out, the Uranus-Neptune came out with making film, making photography and stuff like this, right? There's something, I was reading more, I'm starting to read Matter and Memory by Henri Bergson, and I haven't gotten that far into it yet. I have read the Deleuze book on Bergsonism, but there's something where he's talking about the hard problem of consciousness, right? And Bergson takes this approach that, if you start from this Cartesian place where we accept that we're all approaching the position of consciousness as we're all human beings who find ourselves in our bodies dealing with the outside world, and the Descartes problem is like, is the outside world real? How do we even know anything's real or not? And all this kind of stuff, right? And the issue is that I'm probably doing a terrible job of explaining this, but from a Bergson point of view, that what we experience as the world around us are images that are supposedly, if you take a kind of materialistic approach to consciousness, that at least we have optic nerves and stuff like this that render the images, because we may not know how consciousness works, but we know that if you have an injury to your optic nerves, then you're not going to see, you're going to be blind, right? And that by that, the way our nervous system works, that you can have an injury to your nervous system that may affect your movement, or it may affect your ability to be paralyzed, right? If you affect your nervous system, you won't be able to feel in certain part of your body, and so you may have your different sensory organs impeded by the material mechanical nervous system, right? And so Bergson basically just says, what we can see is that we have two systems. We have one system where which we call subjective, where whatever we're perceiving may be influenced by whether our sensory apparatus is damaged or not, or whether we're under influence of drugs, or whether we're different subjective things happening to our body is going to change our perception. Whereas objectivity, in this sense, it suggests a reality that is independent of what our own body condition is like, that somebody else could be in the room who has, like, somebody could be drunk and somebody could be sober, but they're both experiencing the same reality. It's just that the subjective body stuff is creating a difference. And so Bergson is saying all we need to do, this is my interpretation anyways, is to say that there's the internal system and there's the other system, and that these systems aren't even necessarily two different systems. They're actually the same system, because, you know, your body appears as a perception image in your consciousness, just as somebody else's body appears as a perception image in somebody, you know. But this is what I'm getting at, is that Bergson's approach says at the end of the day, whether it's your body or somebody else's body or a tree or, you know, whatever, it's still just an image, right? And that in the Bergson model of reality, everything just bottoms out at images, right? And so there's the issue of, you know, film and TV, and I think Chris Brennan mentioned this in one of his videos about, like, that the idea of Neptune being like seeing a photograph. If you've never seen a film before, a photograph, it's like, wow, it's a picture of reality. It's something that captures, but it's not though, right? It's just an image. But in some way, though, if we accept the fact that, you know, we say that TV isn't real because we know there are real actors that hired to play the parts, and that the characters are written in scripts, and it's a fantasy that's put on, is it just a dream or something, right? But what is interesting is that at the level of images, an image is an image is an image, right? There's no real difference between an image of, there's an image of Gandalf on the screen versus an image of Ian McKellen on the screen, not in a role. But at some level, when we're, the way that on the level of images, it doesn't really make a difference that, like, Gandalf isn't less real than Ian McKellen in some way. In that you could flick the channel and have an interview of Ian McKellen talking about his role as an actor, being an actor, or you could flick to the actual Lord of the Rings starring Ian McKellen as Gandalf. But, like, at some point, what I'm trying to say is that at the level, I mean, it's kind of ripping off Weird Studies, something that they were talking about in their last episode, but I think maybe it's just on my mind, but there's this thing that, like, that we are living in a world that's so completely saturated with images that, and that we kind of forget this, that we kind of think we have a bearing on reality of what's real, because we know that this is just a movie, and this is my real life, and my real life is not a movie, and that we have this, but I don't know if what I'm trying to say is too subtle, but there's a certain conscious level where an image is just an image, and that there's certain images that we say this is a real image because I'm in my real life, the real world where things are hard and material, and that this character that is in an image in a story is just a fantasy character, and he's not as real as the real world. But I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to listen to the latest Weird Studies episode. These guys do a better job than I do with it. I just intuit there's something about the problem of our post-truth society and our media-saturated world, or that there's something where we haven't appreciated the power of images quite, or about how the reality bottoms out in the image. And that's something about, with Bergson, I don't know. For some reason, this, to me, there's something where you can make this work with Rick Tarnas, and you can make it work with a lot of other stuff. And I even found a Bergson quote today where Bergson is talking about that if we really perceive reality as it is, we would realize we're in a piece of art, or that we would put ourselves in harmony with the music of the universe. You know what I mean? And that's kind of astrology, right? It's like to harmonize your life with the movement of the spheres, right? Harmonize your life with the music of the cosmos, which is to see the movements of the planets and the rhythms of life as a grand aesthetic picture. And you can do a Bergsonian approach that is literate with theoretical physics and more sophisticated approaches to weaving this into a kind of a, I mean, you know, I'm also kind of like, I have to be honest that I'm kind of just playing around. I don't really care about convincing anybody or making a really objective, serious theory. I'm just having fun though. I'm having fun with ideas. It doesn't really matter if you want to do Bergsonian astrology or not. But I'm just what's going to motivate me to do 40-minute astrology videos every day is kind of more where I'm thinking about. How do you stay enthusiastic and creative and active and productive and not just get bogged down in the I don't know. How do you keep the spark of creativity and production in your work, right? Who knows? Well, hopefully you like this one. I'll see you next time.